And hi, everyone. My name is Elise Grissmeyer. I'm the Associate Legal Director for the Cabrini Center, which is the legal department of Catholic Charities for Houston.
So Brandy, do you want to introduce the really fun, exciting topic we have for everybody today?
Yes, I'm trying to, gather my bearings. So today's topic, we will be talking about sexual violence in the homeless community. And this is a very interesting topic and a great topic because we are going into the holidays and the weather is changing because, if people had noticed, if you've been outside, it is gloomy in certain areas and cold. So let's go ahead and get right into our conversation. And anyone can feel free to answer this question first. Who are we talking about when we refer to the homeless community?
So I can share from the Beacon's perspective. So we are certain programs, because we are a partner agency of the Way Home, which is sort of like the hub for housing for the homeless here in Houston. We go by the federal definition of homelessness. And so there's 4 broad categories for that. People who are living in a place not meant for human habitation, such as, an abandoned home that doesn't have any running AC or heat, living out of their cars, that counts as well, or in an emergency shelter. In transitional housing, we see that a lot with people who are struggling with substance abuse and going through recovery, or transitioning out of the criminal justice system, and the common term is halfway houses. And then or the last category is exiting an institution where they temporarily resided. And so I think it's a really great question to start with, because I think everyone has an idea of what homelessness is, depending on your life experience and what you've seen, right? I like to call it, there's visible homelessness and then invisible homelessness, right? And I think that there are a lot of people who we don't see out on the streets or in our daily lives that do struggle with homelessness or at risk. And I think that we're going to get further into that today. But I'd also like to just comment that Beacon Law, our legal program, we have a broader definition of homelessness, and we've kind of continued to move upstream in a sense where we want to focus on those who are at risk or what we call housing imperiled, because we want to be preventative where we can as well. So not only are we serving clients who come to us through our day center, which most of our clients are chronically homeless, and have been homeless for a while and on the streets for a while, we are trying to catch those who especially have been exposed or at risk because of the pandemic and are situationally homeless, where they're living paycheck to paycheck and they are just finding themselves like one, month away from not being able to pay rent. And then being out on the street. So we have a broader definition because of our grant funding, but that kind of gives you an idea that there's lots of different kind of just ideas of what homelessness is.
And Elise, do you want to add on to that?
Sure. So homelessness is not in and of itself a requirement to receive services through Catholic Charities, but we do work with the low income immigrant community in the Houston area. Our focus is exclusively immigration work, so our exposure to homelessness comes through that work. I work specifically with immigrant survivors of crime, so a lot of the homelessness and housing insecurity that we see is some of this emergency shelter and transitional housing that Stephanie was talking about, is people fleeing a violent or bad situation in their home life and are insecure in their housing because of that. So we do see a lot of clients who live in cars, who live in shelters, or who kind of bounce between people's homes, who aren't living on the streets or in vehicles or in abandoned housing, but certainly don't have a place of their own or any permanent or stable situation. I do like the way Stephanie explains it. You obviously are well versed on this, and I think it is important to think of it as this like spectrum of housing security, where it's not just exclusively people living on the streets, but also people who are at risk of that in the very near future without community support.
So this question can go for either of you, but I think it might be best targeted towards Elise. what are some of the ways that being a victim of sexual violence can lead to someone becoming homeless or facing housing insecurity?
Yeah, in a lot of different ways. So sexual violence and physical violence, abuse of any kind is one of the driving factors for children to leave home and run away. I looked up a few statistics before we started, but roughly 60% of girls under 18 who ran away from home reported sexual violence as one of the driving factors for that. But we also see it a lot with our adult survivors as well, that sexual and physical violence, whether it's from a roommate, landlord, or intimate partner, is one of the reasons that adults will be forced to leave home as well. But unfortunately, there's also sexual violence risks on the other side of that decision as well. So that not only is it a driving factor for someone to leave home, it also opens them up to being vulnerable to violence once they leave home. So yeah, it's both a driving factor and a risk factor afterwards.
Well, let's expound more on the risk factor. Is this a specific risk for teens, the LGBTQ community, and undocumented victims?
I'd be happy to handle the undocumented question. I think for when we're talking about sexual violence, any vulnerable or marginalized groups are at a higher risk. So sometimes that vulnerability is created, and sometimes it's preyed upon an existing vulnerability. So if someone is low income, for example, that might be a way for someone to coerce, compel, or otherwise make them vulnerable to sexual violence through grooming, through coercion, through a lot of different means. And the same thing with an undocumented survivor. We've seen a lot with our undocumented survivors who don't have a social security number to go through a credit check, to go to an apartment complex and rent housing like we normally would. They have to rely on people renting rooms in houses, and they know that housing is hard to replace. So if a landlord is pressuring them into sexual acts and threatening them with loss of their home in order to get them to comply, it does make them vulnerable to those kinds of threats of extortion.
Elise, excuse me, not Elise. Stephanie, have you seen the being younger, maybe being a teen victim, maybe being a member of the LGBTQ community, has that posed a greater risk for people facing homelessness?
Definitely. We do specific outreach to the young adult community here in Houston because we've found it is pretty daunting for them to visit us here at our day center. Most of our clients here are older, and it's pure chaos here. The numbers, our capacity is limited now because of the pandemic, but I think it can just be a really intimidating place to be when you're a young adult. So we have partnered in the past with Salvation Army YARC, their Young Adult Resource Center, and then Angel Reach, which is up in Montgomery County. And we've definitely seen that's a prevalent issue among young adults and the LGBT plus community. And I want to speak to, I think, what Elise was saying in terms of just the lack of support and just the vulnerability factor. There is definitely, I feel like, gaps in our system, especially when it comes to young adults, because a lot of times, when you go from 17 to 18 or 16 to 17, when it comes to our criminal justice system, there's this automatic switch of how we perceive and how we treat individuals. And I think that there's sort of this just ability or inability to really kind of have that transition when you're talking about the young adult community. One story, and this was actually before I started working with the Beacon, but I used to do some child welfare work and represented youth aging out of foster care. And I think this is one of the places where we can see that there are some gaps, right? This young woman, who she wasn't my client, but she was a colleague's client. She had been arrested, and because she was 17, she was jailed in the Harris County Jail. And then when she was released, she was still in, you know, technically and legally in the custody of CPS. But because it was an adult jail, there was no ability for them to hold her like there would have been for juvenile in the juvenile justice system. So because of that, she was off on her own, you know, in the streets and got sexually assaulted. Unfortunately, it was a really tragic situation. But that is, you know, a clear example of a gap that we find ourselves in when we talk about these vulnerable communities.
So I want to expand on the vulnerable communities. What about like mental health? Is that are they vulnerable in regards to the sexual violence and homelessness as well? Do you see a lot of that between
Absolutely.
that comes within your facility or your agency?
Yes, absolutely. And another example would be somebody you know, we had assisted not too long ago. It was within this year, and he was actually an older gentleman. And we were assisting him with like an ancillary legal issue, but he was just kind of sharing his story with me. And just because, you know, of struggling with mental illness and substance abuse because he was self-medicating, and just kind of being in the wrong crowd, wrong time, and being physically vulnerable in the sense that he didn't have a roof over his head and was just kind of exposed. He was repeatedly a victim of sexual violence until he sought help, you know, with us and a few other our partner organizations. So really, it was really tough to hear that, but I think it can happen across the spectrum, especially with those that are struggling with mental illness as well.
So both of you all have touched on how it sounds like recent sexual violence can kind of lead somebody who's already in a vulnerable position when it comes to housing to very quickly becoming homeless or experiencing somewhere on the spectrum of homelessness or housing insecurity. Can prior trauma, let's say child sexual abuse or things like that, can that end up leading to somebody to be more vulnerable at being homeless?
Absolutely. I think one of the hallmarks of trauma is it can resurface unexpectedly and have unexpected consequences. So it doesn't affect any two people the exact same way, but trauma in general does rewire our brains and makes certain activities harder. So even something as simple as memory recall can be affected. Depending on the severity of the trauma, it might be harder for people to hold down a full-time job. They might not be mentally or physically able to do that until they get treatment, get help. So absolutely, it can be something that happens immediately after a crime, or in the case of childhood sexual assault, for example, it might take a little bit of time for that to make its way to the surface.
And I would just add on, especially if the trauma hasn't been addressed, and there hasn't been a lot of support around that. Because, you know, I feel like on the other side of that is resiliency factors, right? And there are, you know, individuals that go through trauma and come through resilient, but it all depends on external factors to help with that. And so I think often in low income communities, or when there's a cycle of trauma that has not been addressed, I think that just exacerbates the issues that we see.
So in regards to like the sexual violence and domestic violence in the homeless community, are there more clients being seen for those that are like dealing with, they're living with somebody because they didn't have a place to stay, or they're in a shelter, or is it happening more on the street? Are y'all seeing it more on the, like people on the street, or is it just like environments to where I need to survive, so I need to go into, you know, I met up with X, Y, and Z, and I need a safe, not even a safe, but like a secure place for the moment to stay. So like, where is it happening? Is it happening more on the homelessness of the street, are y'all seeing, or more like in regards to like behind somebody's home?
I mean, domestic violence and sexual assault happen in every environment. So I don't know about the prevalence of domestic violence, for example, happening in the home versus outside the home. I do know that there is a high rate for across the gender spectrum too, for people who are experiencing homelessness, particularly when that homelessness overlaps with some kind of mental illness or trauma. But I can't compare statistics, I don't think necessarily. But like a lot of these things they're overlapping. So someone who might be more at risk or who has experienced domestic violence or sexual violence in the home may be more vulnerable to it while experiencing homelessness as well.
Also, Stephanie, you might be able to speak on this as well, and you may have some thoughts. But I'm also kind of wondering if people who are living in, and I'm sure this happens in every large city, but I live in the Austin area, and it's something that we've seen a huge increase in, is people living in these tent encampments or these makeshift shelter encampments. And as basically property values and available affordable housing, property values have skyrocketed over the last 10 years here, and available affordable housing has just all but disappeared compared to the massive influx of people we've had. And you've seen a very direct correlation with the increase of people living in these very makeshift shelters that almost turn into, I mean, these cities of hundreds of people. And in my experience in working with APD in the past, we would see some pretty horrific assaults coming out, or assault arrests coming out of those areas. But really only it was the same couple of officers who would make a point to patrol there, go check in on people who were living there. And so it just kind of made me realize there has to be a significantly high portion of these crimes, like domestic violence and sexual assault as a whole, that are just not getting reported. I mean, have you seen something like that in people who are actually living on the street or having to live in their cars?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it does go underreported. And so I think I can't really speak to like specific statistics around that. But I will just say I do feel like, in general, encampments, and it might be different from like Austin to Houston, but there is a general sense that it is not very desirable to kind of like the larger community. And, just speaking about sort of like the legislation that just got passed with HB 1925 and kind of like criminalizing camping. But I know that when we, with encampments in Houston, at least, I think that there is sort of, a push to make sure that it can be as safe a space as possible when it comes to just our partnership with the Coalition for the Homeless. I know a lot of times they're making sure to make their rounds, and we have HPD's hot team, the homeless outreach team. And so I think as much as possible, there's interaction, with those encampments to make sure that they're being monitored. But I also know that, with like what Elise said, like with any type of, situation where you are finding yourself vulnerable, which is definitely, I would say, in a encampment community, that, it is possible to find those situations. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I definitely don't want to, or it's my, my perspective that I feel like I don't want to say that all encampments are bad, or there's a higher prevalence of crime or sexual violence just because of the encampment.
We're gonna say there's no statistics on it. Like there's no statistics. So how do evictions affect a survivor's ability to find safe and stable housing? And either one of y'all can take that one.
I'm happy to talk about it. So an eviction, just generally speaking, will follow you around. My understanding is 7 years. It stays on your credit report. So it will obviously be something that future landlords will look at when you're trying to rent homes in the future. So absolutely will affect a survivor's ability to find appropriate housing. There are some limited protections for survivors who have been victimized on the leased property. So if someone suffers stalking, domestic violence, or sexual assault actually physically on the property, they should be protected in breaking a lease early to move out. But as far as evictions, again, that's going to follow them around for a while. So it does put a hold on their ability to find a safe place to live.
Yeah, and I will just comment that I don't think that our current laws are very victim friendly. I feel like in practice, what we've seen is a lot of times it's a very narrow. There are narrow criteria that you meet, and it's a really high bar. You have to get some type of court order, whether that's like a protective order or it's part of like, a divorce petition where there's a finding of, domestic violence. And then you have to serve that to the landlord in writing. Like there's all of these like stipulations in order for you to break that lease and get out of it legally. And so a lot of times we've had to try, because our client is not meeting all of those standards, and we have a very tight time frame to make this work, because obviously especially if the abuser is still in the picture, we've had to settle outside of those stipulations and just do kind of like a general settlement of the lease terms. And also I would say that it doesn't take into account when the abuser is destroying property. We had a client who her porch got burnt down, and we tried to do what we can, but there wasn't anything clear in the law that said that, if this was a result of domestic violence or, a domestic relationship situation, that, there's some remedy or recourse for that. So it was really difficult, I think, for survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence to get through those types of housing issues outside of just like an eviction.
Because even though they can put that in a vulnerable situation as well, because even if they are able to break their lease, through having sexual violence, through sexual violence, and they meet the requirement of 30 days, then the question is, where do they go after that?
Right.
Because they're not entitled to another place to stay, and they're already scared,
Exactly.
And, if they're in a affordable housing or an apartment complex. So that can increase the homeless population as well.
Absolutely. And we saw a lot, especially at the very beginning of COVID, where everything was just frozen. Everyone was frozen in place in their homes, that there wasn't a lot of mobility. People weren't moving from place to place, and were even more hesitant than usual to take action, to break leases, to try to leave their homes, to seek safety. So a lot of people were staying in dangerous situations. And we saw, unfortunately, the reporting rates of sexual and family violence go up drastically. Everyone was at home.
That's an excellent point. Around that time, I had a client who had been living in an RV with her abusive husband for probably about 18 months at that point, and their 2 kids. And she was adamant about not wanting to go to the shelter with her teenagers because she was worried that, for various reasons that I think are obvious to those of us who work in this field, the kids didn't want to go, and she wasn't going to leave them there with dad because she didn't know what would happen. And then we were working with her, got her on a list for housing, and then COVID hit, and it was basically like, you're stuck there. And so she made the decision where she's like, I can't talk to you anymore. It's not safe for me. I'm not leaving my kids behind, and I don't have anywhere else to go. So we're just going to wait it out.
We hear that a lot with, I mean, so much of these things that we're talking about are just the economic limitations. The practical realities of trying to leave home are so huge. People know the risk of homelessness and know kind of the vulnerabilities that come with that too. And they will do what they feel like they need to, even and up to and including staying in a bad situation just to avoid that. Our clients who are undocumented and are facing increased wait times with immigration to get any kind of protection or social security number or work authorization here in the country will stay for years, and we'll talk them through it and counsel them, offer the best advice that we can, but they feel trapped until they have tools to be self-sufficient. It is really disheartening sometimes that all these systems in place that Stephanie alluded to earlier, the systems that build resiliency, the systems that help people escape victimization and build a stronger path forward can fail them at times. And we have to work hard to kind of help them along that path, even understanding that how long these paths can take.
On that note, I have a question kind of about the other side about this. And in doing some research in preparation for this, I started reading about the lack of resources for offenders. And I think as people who serve survivors, there kind of feels a little bit of an antipathy towards that. But I was reading about how much the lack of resources for offenders, such as housing, employment, et cetera, often leads to recidivism. Stephanie, have you run into situations where, you know, maybe that's an offender, but it's somebody who's experiencing some variation of housing insecurity, maybe mental illness or something like that, where they have a hard time trying to find a place to live?
Absolutely. I think that because they are not an empathetic population, you know, there are not a lot of resources, but there's a fallout because of that, you know, a community fallout, because when we're talking about sex offenders, and, you know, there's the sex offender registry, it's public, like, you know, there's all these requirements that they have to meet. A lot of our homeless clients are sex offenders because of that reason. There are not a lot of places for them to go, and not a lot of, just communities, you know, that are going to welcome them. I think to an extent it's understandable, but it's also like, also sort of, you know, more expensive as a society for us to do that. There's not really a focus on rehabilitation. I mean, when we're talking about sex offenders, I think we also have to acknowledge that a lot of them were victims at one point in time as well. So then what do we do with that? You know, I feel like for the large part, I think we're ignoring it, and causing a lot of just kind of a reverberation of economic consequences because of it. So I feel like on that end, there's a lot more we can do.
Lisa, you want to add to, or?
I don't work with offenders typically as part of what we do, though we understand any clients in any kind of service work, people are not perfect people. So even offenders deserve the right to safe and continued housing. So you're right. When we talk about homelessness, when we talk about victimization, we're talking about all these kind of overlapping social issues. You can't really address the problems in one system until you fully address the problems in another, because all of these things have this domino effect of in the community that can lead to public safety or it can't. So you're right in saying that the offender population have themselves often been victimized from youth and been traumatized themselves, and we're not doing enough to support them on release and have them fully reintegrated back into the community in a way that would lead them away from recidivism and towards public safety. But again, we have to kind of address all of these issues all together. So in order to address homelessness, you really have to talk about this. You have to talk about better laws for survivors. So I guess we should just fix all of these systems. That's really easy. So I'm glad we had this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I love the fact that, because you do have to talk about it. Like, we can't just, It is true. There are, sex offenders that are living on the street that are possibly are causing, the increase in sexual violence on the street. So if we can fix that, then other things can be reduced as well. So
yeah, but it's also talking about like fair rent and fair wages and access to medical care. And yeah, so if we're going to talk about systems, we need to fix all of those systems need to be fixed as well. Brittany, you alluded to it in the Austin area, but just in the last year, like the price of a single family home went up by, I think, roughly 15% in the Houston area, which is insane. And just the availability of affordable housing in general is decreasing, and fewer people are going to have safe places to live. So yeah, all of these problems kind of compound.
Yeah.
We have to redefine what is affordable housing. That's the
Mhm.
like, what is the new definition of affordable housing now?
Yeah.
And I guess, quote unquote, post pandemic, even though we're still in it, but we're on the other
Yeah.
side of what is affordable housing and what does that look like?
And then you
Absolutely.
get into like the wage gap, you get into like
Mhm.
educational, you know, issues and
Yeah.
disparities. It's yeah.
Access to medical care. How many people are homeless because of medical debt and have gone bankrupt
Right.
because of hospital bills? While we're at it, if we can go ahead and fix the immigration system to allow people to work with dignity and have fair wages, I'll just add that to our list for that would be fantastic.
So that is a great segue into what are some of the myths and misconceptions about the sexual abuse in the homeless community?
Yeah.
I mean, we pretty much talked about a lot of it. I mean, we really misconception. I mean, we've talked about some. So if there's anything that we haven't talked about, if y'all want to bring up myths and misconceptions about the sexual abuse in the homeless communities, you know, feel free.
I think I one thing too that just kind of made me think of this is and I think both of y'all can probably speak to this. One of the things that I struggle with in getting people to care about survivors who are experiencing homelessness is that a lot of times people in this country view it as you did something to wind up there, otherwise your life wouldn't have been like this.
Yep.
Therefore, it's not worth my effort to expend these resources. Or
Yep.
you choose to live this life, and that's part of the risk that you assume. And I think that's something that both of y'all, I'm sure, have run into when working with the populations that y'all have.
Mm-hmm.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Brittany, with
Mhm.
that. That's exactly what I was thinking, that I think the misconceptions stem from our, I think just society's propensity to other, you know, and kind of put in a box what they don't understand or what they haven't experienced. And it's the same thing as like, I don't know, just dehumanizing somebody that you see that's panhandling on the street because you're in a car and you can just kind of pass by them and not look them in the eye. It's hard. I mean, like, I'm not saying that you know, people who do that are evil. I feel like I'm guilty of that as well. I feel like our culture is just kind of desensitized to that, you know, in a sense, when we see something from afar and don't really have the story behind it, we kind of make up a story. And I feel like, yeah, I think that I can't, you know, say this is everyone, and I'm not going to generalize, but the clients that we work with, whether they're survivors or they're offenders, because we've worked with both, there is this overall sense from most that they are just trying to get by like everyone else, you know, and they just, systems have failed them their entire lives. And they are sort of in this desperation mode where they just don't have anyone else that is sort of listening to them or kind of there to help them. And they're just, yeah, they're just trying their hardest, you know. I think Brene Brown says, like, we have to assume that everyone is trying their best or else we'll go crazy. And just as a tangent, but I want to, you know, share this because it's so good not to share. John Oliver had a segment the other night on homelessness. It's like 20 minutes long. It's very long for, you know, those are used to like the short bites nowadays, but it's really worth it because I feel like he does a good job of accurately depicting, like, you know, what we're talking about today, which is there's a huge spectrum of what homelessness means, and does also a good job of like poking fun at some of, you know, some people that have maybe a more narrow version of it and kind of able to expand that. So yeah, it's worth a watch.
I'm going to go off on a tangent as well, but all of this kind of like this misconception of panhandlers, for example, makes me think of all the criticism that I hear from people, especially as regards to immigrants and asylum seekers, of just there's this kind of, well, how could they? I mean, why would you ever endanger your child by bringing them to a different country that you don't know and that you're at risk of being poor in there as well? And it's this whole idea of poverty as a moral failing, that somehow you and your decisions have protected you and you are in a comfortable environment because you have been wise, which is absolutely wild in a country where the majority of people cannot afford a $500 emergency expense. It's just wild. So I think a greater recognition of this idea that we are all 2 or 3 unlucky incidents away from homelessness ourselves, and that we may be supported by certain systems and resources. We might have things in our lives that other people don't, but that doesn't mean we are morally superior to anyone. And given the right set of circumstances, that could be us. But absolutely, and I love John Oliver. I'll have to go watch that. I'm really excited now.
You know, the pandemic showed us that we are a paycheck away from being homelessness.
Absolutely.
So, like, really, it showed that, and people are not going back to work or can't. Nope. And going back to work, a lot of times they can't even afford the wages are ridiculous. So now, not saying it's a vast majority, but hopefully this pandemic has also shown a lot of people that those misconceptions are not true and myths, because that could be you, the person that was driving in the car, past it. And I am guilty of that too. I passed the panhandlers as well, but you know, looking at them differently, because that could be you literally right now, this pandemic, you know, a lot of people
1 month from now,
right, 1 month away. So hopefully soon, I don't know how soon, but very soon, people are now starting to realize that that actually could be them, because this pandemic showed that specifically. So
yeah.
Any myths or misconceptions that we want to talk about, bring up, clarify? Let me say, clear the ear, clear the air is what I'm trying to say.
I don't think this is a misconception as much. I just would be remiss if I didn't mention that, you know, at play here is also racial disparities at work and just like racist institutions. I mean, I think that it doesn't have to go without saying, like, and we all know this, but I do think that that intersection is important to at least bring up when we're talking about homelessness and sexual violence as well. I feel like, you know, there's a lot of intersection between racism and poverty, you know, and the inability to, you know, I hate this term, but like pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. There's so much more to it than that. And I feel like we are doing a disservice when we think that that's all you need to do.
No, I completely agree. And I'm glad you brought that up. I lived in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, and it was very striking to see the disparity where the available housing was, what it costs there compared to what it costs in other sections of the city, and the racial divide in the homeless community was stark, for lack of a better term. And I say that coming from Austin, which is like literally one of the most segregated cities in the country. So it was eye-opening.
I think if we're going to talk about race and racism in all of these systems, it's important to think about it in the context of this conversation when it comes to reporting sexual assault, that it might be an additional reason and an additional hesitation that would keep someone from reporting abuse. We see it all the time with our undocumented victims, is if you're from a marginalized community and you don't have a history of positive interactions with law enforcement, they will be the absolute last people you will call if you are sexually assaulted or feeling vulnerable. So it's no surprise that that a lot of these crimes do go underreported.
And that's within the African-American community, because of what's been going on, especially been shown this last year. A lot of people are scared to call because they're having 2 fears. One, I don't want you to kill him or her or kill me. Yeah. So that's why a lot of times they're being unreported, because and then if there's children involved, they're like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be responsible for, you know, my child's other parent to lose their life. So
we worked with a homeless survivor at Catholic Charities who had been sexually abused, but both her mental illness was making her vulnerable. So she was unable to find safe housing for a lot of her adult life. She's in her 60s now. She was living with adult children for a while, but her mental illness made it impossible for them to keep her there. And it got really bad. So being homeless, she wasn't able to afford medication that she needed. She was schizophrenic and she was having a really hard time preventing herself from disassociating in just normal conversations. But she reported so many sexual assaults to the police that they stopped taking reports, and they would just kind of dismiss her each time as it's just crazy. And she does have a hard time separating her kind of visual and auditory hallucinations from facts. Sometimes it really does happen for her. But I think because of that, rather than taking the time to sit through to connect her to resources and figure out what had actually happened, they just dismissed her over and over and over. So she truly felt there was no one to protect her. Where was she going to go? And she's better now and is safer. And there is a happy ending to that story once she was connected to counseling and medication and got plugged into resources that way. But it is really disheartening for people when they don't feel like their complaints are heard or they're dismissed because of their own mental illness and victimization. But yeah, those resources are absolutely crucial.
On that note, maybe both of y'all can talk about some ways that the existing resources we have are lacking. Something interesting that I came across that I kind of felt like an idiot for not realizing before, but in researching this, is pointing out that your classic Rape Crisis Center is a place that offers a hotline and in-office counseling, both of which aren't really going to do somebody a lot of good if they don't have a phone, they don't have transportation, and after their counseling session, they don't have anywhere to go live where it's safe and stable. So there are other ways that y'all have seen lack of resources impact, where this community intersects?
We work with, obviously, again, undocumented survivors. They don't qualify for Section 8 housing, so their search for housing is really complicated by that. That they can qualify for shelters, but those are limited in term and subject to capacity and funding limitations. So I think just an increase in capacity in Houston, especially after the pandemic, we're still dealing with this, and especially with all these other factors that we were talking about, I can imagine that it will only be harder and harder in the future to find temporary, safe housing. So that would be a huge gap that I would like to see addressed.
Yeah, I agree. And what we're finding right now with the Beacon is that we do housing assessments, and a large majority of people who are coming to the Beacon since the pandemic are not eligible because we have to prioritize because of funding and just, the way things work is people who are chronically homeless. And there's specific definitions you need to meet for that. It either needs to be for the previous 12 months or like I think 4 episodes of homelessness that aggregate to 12 months within the last 3 years. So lots of rules. And we're finding that those people who are, I kind of mentioned before, situationally homeless are not going to be eligible for the housing. And unfortunately, we've had to kind of redirect them to the best resources possible, like 211, and just try to redirect where we can. But I can't help but think, like, are they getting lost in the system? What happens after that step? That's not our focus. Our focus is to prioritize those who are frequenting our day center and are coming in because they're chronically homeless. But I think that there will be an increasing number of people because of the pandemic that are situationally homeless, and we kind of are going to see ourselves in a crisis and need to identify more resources. And I also just had a thought that I was listening to the news yesterday, and I forget which state what this was in, but there were actually like dollars that were trying to be connected, because of the pandemic and like, all of the rental assistance that is going around. But there was a challenge of trying to connect those funding sources to the people who needed it. And I'm not sure if we're seeing that in Houston, but I imagine that there's a lot of, moving parts to that. And so I feel like there could be this possibility, and it's not something that is impossible, but we need to kind of work towards that and have a focus on that.
Okay, because you mentioned this, Stephanie, and I'm kind of familiar with it, but the bill that just passed to criminalize homelessness.
Mhm.
So I'm thinking that we may see a lot more people going to jail because of their being homeless, because we don't have the resources to take care of the homelessness. So that's be an issue.
Yeah, and so we're actually not, I don't think that we're going to see a lot of that impacted in Houston. The bill was politically targeted to Austin, unfortunately, and I was just on a call with people from Texas Fair Defense Project around this issue. I think what it's going to look like is, on the municipal level, there's going to be a lot of like Class C tickets issued. So those are fine only. But the problem with that, exactly.
I mean, this is a rhetorical question. Like, there's a fine, but if I don't have, okay, I'm sorry.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, this is bad debt, never going to be collected on. It's going to cause a lot of like, just unnecessary administrative costs and all of that. Not to mention, there's going to be now a lot of outstanding warrants. That's sort of like our area of expertise. Like we find ourselves sort of helping our clients who are homeless navigate all of these tickets that they're getting. And it's like a cycle of, well, they don't want to show up to court because they already have a warrant out. And so it just piles and piles up, and it affects their ability to get a driver's license, which is your pathway to get a job and get housing. And it's just a huge mess. So the reason I say we're probably not going to see a huge impact in Houston is because there's actually a municipal law on the books that bans camping, and it's kind of similar, but I think we have the City of Houston Homeless Court, which is run in part by the Coalition for the Homeless. So we have kind of safety nets in place for that. And I think that there's also been a push for just HPD not to ticket, and to find other ways to divert those types of issues. But yeah, I don't know what the future holds for other jurisdictions. Unfortunately, it didn't look very positive from what Texas Fair Defense shared with us a couple weeks ago.
Well, thank you for clarifying that, because for our listeners as well too. So
yeah, no problem.
Well, Bree, do you have anything else?
I guess to just kind of wrap up, what are some things you think that we as service providers could do better to try to meet the needs of this intersectional community here? I mean, obviously our wish list that we just put together about solving all of these huge issues, of course, we're going to get to work on that right away. But what are just some things you think that maybe we could do a little bit better?
Obviously in the absence of fixing all of these huge societal systems, I think we as providers, something simple that we could do is just to educate ourselves a little bit better on what resources actually are available. So I actually have never heard of the homeless court that you just mentioned. I
haven't either. So
I live in Houston. I work with vulnerable and low income communities. I've never heard of that.
Let's talk after this. Yeah.
Let's talk after this for sure. But just being aware of how the shelter systems work, how we can better make referrals, how we can divert people to systems in place. Catholic Charities, for example, is one of the City of Houston partners for the rental assistance program through COVID. So pushing that information out to our community partners in a way that we can connect people. There's so many nonprofits doing so many different wonderful things that the more we can talk amongst ourselves and and make better referrals, the fewer people will slip through these systems.
Absolutely. And I mean, I'm mostly speaking for myself, but I do really feel like we can be very siloed in our work, and it's no one's fault. It's just because we're putting out fires every day. And the reality is there's always going to be more people that need help than people that can help when it comes to legal aid community, unless like, I don't know, like somebody prove me wrong and like, you know, and give us tons of more funding, but
Yeah.
you know, so yeah, I totally agree with what Elise is saying, just being able to find those connections and resources and thinking outside the box, and yeah, just bridging those gaps.
And keep having these conversations and keep listening to
Absolutely.
the safe space for these conversations and resources. You know, shameless plug.
Yes, thank you for having us today, ladies.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Well, ladies, if somebody wanted to reach out to your organizations, how would they get in touch with you? Let's start with Stephanie.
Sure. So we have a website. It's beaconhomeless.org, and you can click on the programs, and Beacon Law will pop up. You'll see our online application. You will see our practice areas that we mostly provide services for, and a bunch of other resources.
And
Same
Elise?
with other Catholic Charities. It's catholiccharities.org. Catholic Charities does a long laundry list of things in the community that are wonderful. We have food pantries and counseling. We have a shelter for female veterans who are at a particularly high risk for homelessness themselves. So please check out our website. The Cabrini Center is our immigration legal department. You can click on that link and find out info on how to get a free consultation.
You know, and that just came up a point. We didn't think about that vulnerable population. Veterans are, you know, coming. Yeah, we didn't.
Mhm.
Not, yeah.
Not enough time.
Yeah, can't cover all of it in our.
Well, thank you, ladies. This was an awesome show. I hope everybody is able to, you know, get the resources that is needed. If you know somebody who is in one of these situations, please do not sit in silence. You can also contact Lone Star Legal Aid. If you're in any of our 72 counties, you can go to www.lonestarlegal.org, or you can call 713-652-0077. I do not know what the 1-800 number, but it's on our website if you would like to apply. And that's it. That's all I have.